So before we go on to examine the incredible backgrounds and disciplines of my three esteemed guests, I'm going to talk a little bit, I've been asked to talk a little bit about myself, which is always nice. So I am the curator of Alternate Realities, which is a touring digital art program as part of Sheffield Doc Fest. Let's just see if this is going to, I'm just going to go back one. Okay. So this year, as I said before, we had a great exhibition at the FI, and since Sheffield, we've been touring in the UK and we've been touring internationally. We're very passionate about the kind of work we tour, and in particular, we tour a lot of immersive works in VR, AR, MR. And over the years, we've had the chance to show some quite extraordinary experiences, and I just thought in the 2 minutes I've got, I will share those with you. The first is an experience called Munduruku Journey to the Heart of the Amazon, which saw the user encased in a kind of giant green egg. They would watch a virtual reality film, they would feel it through a vibrating backpack, and they would have smell, light, and heat. The second is Doom Room, Enter If You Dare, an immersive theatre project. It's kind of psychosexual death ritual, really, which the people of Sheffield really loved, which it combined immersive theatre and VR from a completely bonkers bunch of people called Macropol in Copenhagen. And then I wanted to highlight a couple of other projects. The maker of one of these projects is sitting here with us today, Matthias. Alice, the virtual reality play, and Draw Me Close, both of which involve actors. And we're going to be talking about that a bit today, and the part that has to play in full body immersion. And then finally, with 11 seconds to go, I wanted to talk a little bit about what the future holds. So earlier somebody mentioned Dreamscape, and there are some really interesting things happening in LBE. As Ted said, it's a kind of a stepping stone, but it brings people together, and that's close to my heart. We had an amazing piece called Somni in the UK this year, an immersive theatre piece, and the RSC are working with Magic Leap to create some new experiences, and that's on the kind of story experiential side of this discussion. And then equally, the technology that we're seeing develop is very interesting. We have someone here, Andrew, with us today from Haptics, who's going to be talking about the role of that technology. So this discussion, Full Body Immersion, is about talking about technology, talking about storytelling, where we're going, and what that's going to enable us to experience and do, and from an academic's point of view, also how that will affect our behaviors. I'm now going to pass to my first guest. Please give it up for Grace from the University of Georgia.
Hi, my name is Grace Ahn, and I'm an associate professor at University of Georgia, and I direct the Games and Virtual Environments lab there. The bulk of our research tends to look at how our virtual experiences don't really end in the virtual worlds, but it transfers into our physical worlds and changes the way that we perceive things, the way that we think and feel, and even behave. And so I look at a lot of how these virtual simulations are able to change the way that we behave in health contexts and environmental contexts and even consumer preference contexts. And so I have a quick video that will show you sort of the overview of my lab and our recent work.
Communication technology has really changed the way that we communicate and deliver messages. I think it's opening a new horizon on how we can deal with problems that have plagued society for centuries. The most recent ones being obesity issues and environmental problems. For a lot of these health consequences, your present-day health behaviors seem pretty benign. Over time, these are the things that add up to excess calories. What we found is that personal experiences go a very long way in changing your behavior. And so with a lot of these risk issues, there's a limit as to how you're able to get people to experience becoming obese or having diabetes or having cancer or experiencing what the world might look like 100 years down the road. If we're able to build a schema that is realistic enough for you to rely on when you come across a similar situation, then we may be able to change your behavior based on that schema. A change that we see with virtual reality versus more traditional platforms is that when you are in virtual reality, you are essentially surrounded by a lot of sensory information. So you're able to see and hear and feel as you would in the physical world. And so that sort of tricks your brain into thinking that you may be experiencing this for real, as if you're in the physical world and going through that experience at that moment. You're able to do this to a pretty sufficiently realistic level so that you're able to build a memory of this experience. And so people are able to see and hear and feel as if they went through it or they visited that place, and we call this perception of presence. We're able to show you what this seemingly benign habit added over a few years can have in terms of a future negative consequence for your health. Our findings show that after the virtual simulations, people feel greater personal relevance. They believe that this can happen very soon in the future. Both of these mechanisms help us change your attitude and behaviors toward the risk issue.
Thank you so much, Grace. And I'd now like to introduce Matthias Schellborg, the director of Alice, the virtual reality play that I mentioned before. And Matthias has a few slides he's going to share with us.
So my name is Matthias. Thank you for having me here. I'm an independent filmmaker based in Paris. And my first contact with VR was through the building and conception of high-end VR, AR, and multiple reality experiences for especially luxury brands in Paris, like Hermès, Prada, Chanel, or Dior, which was a very interesting time of experimenting with a variety of projects, be real-time, 360 videos, interactive, and also haptics and mixed reality projects. Last year, and went on to the task of directing a very interesting documentary about Chinese copycat architecture for French television channel Arte. The project was co-directed by Benoît Felici, and it's a reflection on virtual spaces that are actually tangible and you can actually live in them. The project is part of the exhibition here, so you can check it upstairs and have a look. The same year, I wanted to push the reflection by combining element of immersive theater with VR and build a project where the viewer could interact with a live actor whose performance would be sustained by a motion capture system live. And so the experience called Alice, the VR play, was premiered at Venice Film Festival, and it had a beautiful tour for 1 year. And this project opened a new reflection around actually full body immersion and what it means to tell a story with a viewer that is fully part of the story and that it actually can interact with objects and people inside the space. Later this year, I teamed up with a cutting-edge studio, Baobab Studio, based in San Francisco, and together we built a step above Alice, an experience called Jack, which is a free adaptation of Jack and the Beanstalk, and it's also sustained by a live performance of an actor, a live performance through motion captured. But in this piece, you are absolutely free roaming as a viewer, and every single pieces of props and every single pieces of element you see in the virtual space is actually being tracked, and you have an array of multisensory tools inside the space so that the viewer can actually experience through all his senses the story. And this project was premiered at Tribeca, and the part one of it was premiered at Tribeca this year. And we keep working on this interesting piece that puts up the reflection full body immersion.
Marvelous,
That's
thank
it for
you.
me.
And finally, we have Andrew Mitrek, a pioneering technologist from haptics. Thank you,
Great.
Andrew.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. My name is Andrew Mitrek. I'm with a company called Haptex, and we build haptic feedback technology that lets you touch and feel VR. And so what do we really mean by touch? Well, touch is really a combination of sensations. So for instance, if I'm holding a water bottle, I'm feeling that tactile displacement, the pressure sensation against your skin. I'm feeling force feedback. My hand doesn't go through the water bottle like it's a hologram. It stops around the edges. I'm using my hands naturally. My hands are tracked, and I have finger motion tracking. Well, we build gloves that do all of those sensations together. So this is an older one of our prototype gloves, and it has hundreds of little actuators that simulate that touch sensation. So you can feel raindrops or run your hands through wheat. And that's what we call the touch sensation, that tactile pressure. We also have force feedback, and this is achieved through actuators. Think of them kind of like as tendons that stop your hands as you're moving, as you're gripping a steering wheel. The gloves will stop your hands and simultaneously provide that touch feedback. And what's interesting is to provide touch in a realistic manner, you need really precise motion tracking. The reason is because if you think of the difference between a hard touch and a soft touch, I may be moving my hand by less than a millimeter, right? So you want gloves that can really track your hands precisely to be able to render haptic feedback appropriately. And it's not just me at this company, it's about 35 engineers who founded the company back in 2012, solving really hard engineering challenges to build the underlying technology. And it's only in the last year and a half, 2 years that we've been taking this and building this technology into gloves.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you all three guests for sharing some visuals and some of the work you're doing. It's such an interesting panel with such an interesting mix of discipline, and throughout the conversation we're going to be talking about the body, the mind, and the soul. But I quickly just wanted to reflect on the different takes you have. I always think it's interesting to look at people as humans, but it's also quite interesting to look at people through Twitter and to see how they describe themselves on Twitter. And so, Grace, you very perfunctorily describe yourself as, I research communication and digital technology and how they influence us. Matthias, I craft stories you walk in. And Andrew, burrito enthusiast, which I think is really important because you can immediately see the technological enthusiasm that Andrew has for this sensation. And being a burrito enthusiast is being enthusiastic about a sensation. So I wanted to move on to talk about the kind of goals you have in terms of working with full body immersion. And if it's okay, I will start with the burrito enthusiast.
Yes.
Andrew, as a purveyor of new technologies, why are you in this space and what do you hope to achieve?
Yeah, well, I mean, what's funny about the burrito enthusiasm is that you do hear people describe themselves as texture eaters, right? That touch is very important to taste and how we experience everything. More seriously, I think that what haptics is about is making technology adapt more to the human. That I get to give a lot of virtual reality demos, and where people tend to get tripped up is with the controller, with input. Now that I'm in this space, how am I interacting? Especially if somebody's not a gamer or they didn't grow up with holding plastic controllers. And what I really like about seeing people use our gloves is they're using their hands the way they've used their hands their entire life, that everything just feels much more like reality. So I hope that technologies like ours, that virtual reality, really makes technology adopt more to the human versus having humans adapt to the technology.
It's a wonderful sentiment. And moving on to you, Matthias, what's the goal in crafting these stories that people walk into? What do you hope to achieve for an audience?
I think we actually have the same goal. It's just that in the future, you're going to have a glove to feel that you're touching a table. And right now, I would just put a table in a piece so that the people can actually touch them. But the goal is actually the promise of VR for me when I first experienced it was I want to be inside the virtual space. I want to fully feel like I'm a part of this virtual world, and I want to interact with it with a lot of ways. I had a lot of experimentation around interactivity, around 360 video. 360 video, which is totally fine, is an extension to cinema. Whereas for me, VR, when it's a tangible physical space you can walk in, is more of an extension to theater, actually. So for me, it totally makes sense to mix immersive theater with VR and see how a viewer can feel free inside the space and how much I can actually control is going through this space, because I don't want a fully free viewer. I still want to tell a story, and I still want the story to feel linear and to feel like you're embarking on an adventure that I'm still controlling it as a director. So my goal as a storyteller is to find ways to predict and control the behavior of a free viewer and still don't make it feel like I'm holding his hand. So it's
a fascinating tension, that, isn't it? The freedom to be, to move, to truly be, but also you want to steer them into the story. And moving on to behavior, Grace, I mean, that's a large part of your work, isn't it? You're researching how this technology can actually change our behaviors.
Yeah.
And what's your goal in terms of full body immersion, like layering on different technological tools to make us feel more immersed?
Yeah, so every communication technology that we've had in the past decades have changed the way that we communicate and interact with each other. If you think about how the internet has changed the way that we think and feel and behave and communicate with each other, and then the next wave was mobile technology, and that really changes the way that we think about communication speed. Some of my freshman students have told me that if you do not answer and reply back to a text message within 20 minutes, you're no longer a good friend.
Whoa. Wow.
And so if you think about when virtual reality and augmented reality become a ubiquitous tool for communication, they'll inevitably change the way that we communicate with each other, the way that we interact with each other. And so I'm really interested in how these emerging technologies shift the way that we perceive traditional communication rules and how we tell stories, and how that essentially changes the way that even society functions as a whole. What is okay, what is not okay, are behaviors that we used to think that was weird, like pulling out a technology when you are interacting with another person. So when we are side by side, but yet we can augment this communication pattern by using a technology that wasn't there, but now it's pretty much the norm. And so I'm really interested in how all of these behaviors sort of culminate into the way that we change in our minds and behaviors.
That's fascinating. And I'd like to move to talk about our bodies for a little bit, and come back to Andrew in this, and analysing touch and how important touch is. I mean, you think touch is going to be a big part of like the entertainment industry in how we tell stories? And are there, when you break down the different types of touch, will you be able to augment stories and change behaviours because of those different types of touch? Like, will a soft touch make you feel so different to a solid object that you would hold in your hands?
Absolutely, yeah. There's a lot to unpack there. Yeah, I absolutely think that that touch is an important part to storytelling, because when I go to a movie, I want to have something that's memorable. I want to have a memorable experience at the end of a story, and I feel like touch makes it all the more visceral, and it really feels like you're there. A story that I like to tell is that we had an early demo a couple of years ago that I shared with my niece, who was 6 years old at the time, in which you have your hand against a pad and you pick up little animals and they come to life on your hand and you feel their feet. So in this instance, a deer came to life and pranced and danced in your hand and then took a nap, and you could actually feel a subtle warmth to the deer's body. And my 6-year-old niece, as you can imagine, she was overwhelmed by this. She just thought this was so magical. And then I just saw her a couple months ago. She's now 8 years old, and she talked to me about this petting zoo I took her to in Seattle, where I live, and she's like, "Oh yeah, do you remember that petting zoo with that little deer?" And she's speaking about it as if it was a real experience, not something virtual, not something she saw on a screen, but something that she did. And I wonder about the day where she's at school thinking that little deer still exist to this day that are 3 inches tall. I don't want to spoil that surprise for her, but I think that it kind of speaks to this memory that, maybe we're fooling children today, but we'll be fooling full-grown adults pretty soon with the immersiveness of our stories. To the other point about the different types of touch, when you want to convey different ideas, touch there's a lot of nuance to it. I mean, if you think of the soft caress of a loved one, touching your hand, versus like just kind of slowly moving your finger across your hand, it's a very different kind of experience that based on the speed, the dexterity, the pressure, it can really go from something that's loving or sensual or affectionate to something that's creepy or slimy or gross. So there is a lot of stuff to solve there as far as getting touch right and contextualizing it appropriately in a story.
I mean, do you think in the way that we see kind of haptics and vibration, like the sub pack you wear on your back, when it vibrates something ominous is about to happen in the drama. Do you think you can do the same with touch? That you can help to lead story, whether it be the simulation of wind or the simulation of heat? Do you think that's going to augment our story worlds in a way? Is that the kind of future you're preparing for with the work you do?
Absolutely, yeah. What's great about Subpack is it's a vibrational technology, and vibrational haptics has been here for 40 years or more. It's a very it's a simple form of technology of haptics, but you can use it very effectively in storytelling. That there's this merge between the technology that's there and the tools for storytellers. And I feel like getting this in the hands of storytellers to think about how they may re-architect a story around it. For instance, one of our demonstrations is you're at a virtual farm environment, and you can run your hands through wheat and feel raindrops and feel a fox jump into your hand on the farm. And we like animals in hands a lot. And we designed that story around showing a range of sensations, around rain feeling very different than wheat feeling very different than a fox. And I think that's what I'd like to see storytellers do is take this and have their imaginations run wild and just see this as an extra tool in their storytelling pocket.
It's fascinating what you're saying. I mean, apart from the obsession with animals in hands, about this idea of augmenting memories. This idea that this child now has a memory that is a virtual memory, but a real memory. And I think you've done a lot of work, haven't you, in studying how we form memories from these virtual experiences and how that can lead to behavior change.
Yeah, so I guess what's really fascinating about these virtual experiences is that although the graphics may not be as realistic as the real world, our brains are actually pretty good at filling in the little gaps, which is why you were able to enjoy a lot of the grainier black and white films and still get the emotional effects that the film was trying to tell. And so as long as you're telling a good, solid story, it turns out that even if it's virtual and even if it's not as realistic as the physical world, we start building mental maps. And so especially for younger children, it's really difficult to tell what's virtual and what's real. And so when you build a mental map of your experience that has all of the details, so you touched something, you heard something, you saw something in 360, a lot of these mental maps will be stored in your brain, and later on when you come across a very similar situation, you recall these mental maps, and that basically guides your feelings and thoughts about the situation. And so we have some evidence that if you especially expose children under the age of 7, so 4 or 5-year-olds, to these virtual worlds and call them back into the lab later on, they will swear that this really happened, that this was a physical experience. Now, there's definitely some ethical issues when you think about the potentials of how this can end up. But at the same time, you also that really goes to show the persuasive effects and the impacts that virtual experiences can have on both children and adults. And so we see that also in adults as well. Of course, if you are fully grown, then you're a little bit better than better at telling the virtual from the reality. But still, your experiences do kind of resonate with you when you come across some similar situations, and that impacts the way that you behave later on, even weeks after getting exposed to the virtual experience.
It's fascinating. Matthias, when you're crafting all these narratives that you walk in, do you think about building memories for people, or do you think about being very present and just having the experience?
No, definitely. And I think actually touch is one of the main tools I'm using, because when I'm thinking about how much of the viewer should I keep in the story, I mean, avatar-wise, I would always keep like a lip motion to see your hands inside the piece. That's what you see in Alice and in Jack. Because my goal is to limit the amount of technology I put on the viewer so that he feels actually free. I would always choose touch. So, because as soon as you have at least your hands inside the experience, it's somehow connected to childhood curiosity of touching objects. And I will always play in the design of the experience. I would always play with this slight moment when you discover the physicality of the piece. For example, in Jack, you walk into space, and there is a big light bubble hanging at the middle of the room, and everybody would come inside and bang their head on the lamp, and it would change the lighting inside the piece, and they would realize, whoa, if this is real, then what is? And they would start going inside the space and touching stuff. And then my mission is to put just enough things to touch, so that actually your brain fills in the gap, and then you feel like this whole thing is tangible and is real. And then the action kicks in. I remember all the reaction when we were doing Alice. When you start acting with the character, at the beginning it can be an AI, at the beginning it can be a CG character, but when the character starts touching you, and you start holding it or giving a high five to the character, then every single viewer would tell me after the experience that was like a game changer for like a brain fog for the mind, because they realized that that was the forbidden word. Sorry. They realized that if this is real, then what's not? And when you start tricking your brain, it starts filling all the gaps, and it actually builds memories, and it builds experience that you actually went through. And it's funny also because there is the memory, but I think it's linked also to the sensation of timing, for example, and space. For example, not a single viewer from Jack or Alice would tell me a proper time they spent inside the experience.
Like very
none of them. Because I think that when you start existing and be present inside those spaces, you tend to forget everything, and you tend to be totally focused inside them. And of course, we have a moral obligation to be very respectful as a director, because now I feel like we are actually building real, tangible memories, and we are actually building real, tangible experience that the people would remember for years. That okay, they've been to the world of Alice in Wonderland, they've been to the world of Jack and the Beanstalk, and they lived inside of it. And yeah, I think that's something that no other medium has come close to achieve in terms of impact on your sensation and memory.
As we load on these extra layers of immersion, new tools, employing the other senses, and in a minute we should talk about taste and smell as well. And you're right, in terms of ethically how we do that, how we push that. Like if you're testing someone in the lab and you're trying to see if you can change their behaviors, how do you know how much to layer on, the brain farts? I mean, how many brain farts before, someone is like, I was really freaked out, and I may never eat a cheeseburger again, but like I'm really freaked out by the idea of my obesity,
It's a really fine-tuned thing that you have to work with, and we have a lot of, social scientific knowledge that we've been working with, so we understand a lot about human behavior already, and then we're applying this knowledge to how to use virtual reality as a tool. It turns out that if you push that perceived threat too far, then people come to a point where they start feeling fear, and then it's kind of like, whatever. I'm going to die anyway. We call it mortality salience. So I'm going to die anyway. Doesn't really matter. I might as well enjoy another cigarette while I'm at it. And so you need to hit a sort of a sweet spot. But there is the advantage of virtual worlds, like you said. The virtual worlds give you a very malleable sense, a dimension of time and space. And so you're able to really play with that dimension of time. And we try to fast forward a lot of the current present behaviors and we try to show how your present behaviors lead to future consequences by accelerating time. And so we show you sort of a fast forwarded future of if you continue to carry on with your current behaviors, this is the future that you're looking at in 20 years, in 30 years. And so that makes it seem a much more urgent and immediate thing that you need to attend to. And that's what we see leads to a lot of behavior changes, because you do want to avoid this future that is really visceral to you at this moment.
And when the patient, when the user is seeing, the participant, thank you, when the participant is seeing this happen, are they being there watching a figure, or are they being them? Do they have the point of view of their body changing, or and have you steered away from one or the other because of concerns, or because one has a particular efficacy and the other one does not?
Yeah, we play a lot with the concept of identity. So in virtual reality, the concept of identity becomes really gray, because we can build an avatar that looks photorealistically like you, and that becomes your virtual self. But we are able to fully control your virtual self. And so then there's a scenario of the virtual self trying to persuade the physical self to do something. And so we can show you what happens to your virtual self if you continue to eat the way that you're eating right now, or if you continue to not save energy, or if you continue to not exercise. And when that happens, it's not just a message that deals with a third person. It's a message that happens to you, and therefore you become much more personally involved. You see what happens to you in the virtual world in 20 years down the road. And so that makes the message personally involving. It also makes it seem much more urgent. And so when we play with that identity where you are yourself, but someone else is controlling yourself, we call it the virtual doppelganger. And we see that there's a very high impact in terms of persuasion context using the virtual doppelgangers.
Fascinating. So I'm just writing some notes. So I wanted to move on to talk about the soul and storytelling, because that is perhaps the art of the soul. And in terms of what you do, Matthias, these experiences that fool you, that cause your brain farts, or cause you to believe that things are tangible when they're perhaps intangible. How important is it to have other people as opposed to avatars, as just described by Grace, and then simulated touch? Like for you, how important is the presence of other human beings and actors in terms of a full body immersion experience?
Well, I think all of my work, even the 360 work, is about getting human back into the mix and trying to have VR connect people with human aspects. And I think that I've been asking a lot, could you do Alice or Jack with AI? And maybe in a few years we can do that, but what would be the point? Because for me, the whole point is to be together with someone, with a tangible human being inside a totally virtual and fantasy world. And I think that's where the beauty of this type of format is. So I would never replace a human inside the mix. And on the other way around, I would definitely try and experiment with putting more viewers inside the experience. Alice and Jack are like first steps of what's going to come, which is, for me, bigger space experience that you can experience with dozens of viewers together inside a narrative space that you all have a role to play in, and that you all have something to address and something to solve, and you can go through them, and you can go through this immersive space where you can actually go through a story with other people. It's also linked to, should we always have different viewers interacting with each other? And that's something I'm not sure of. I think
the audience interacting with each other.
The audience interacting with each other. I mean, as soon as the audience is interacting with the story, they don't necessarily have to interact with each other, because I think that's where the realm of video gaming is connecting and fighting with the realm of traditional filmmaking. And there is a very interesting line in between, is how much freedom do you give the viewer before it becomes a game, for example. For example, in Jack, if I had another viewer right now, just throw into the piece, they would start talking with each other and they could protect themselves from the universe. Whereas right now, they have no choice but to interact and to become the character, because everything is addressing them directly. They have no protection, they have no comfort zone. So this is very interesting to think about this fine line between video gaming and cinema.
And do you think in the future, it's really interesting that the role of the actor in something like Alice or Draw Me Close, do you think using technology like Andrew's, that you might be able to have an actor in a remote location, have the audience elsewhere, and have the actor capture and be present in the experience for the audience and touch the audience, but not really touch them like this, but touch them with the haptics? And is that something that
it's definitely, as the technology is evolving, it's so interesting, because you can have people experiencing Alice from their home with haptic feedbacks, whereas right now I need to build a physical set to do this type of haptic experience. But the end of the reflection is to have a tangible space, be it through haptic feedback tools or be it through actually building the things. For example, right now in Jack, I have a lot of eating and fans to simulate wind and heat. And when you touch, like, for example, you have this little oven. When the viewer goes to it burns his head, so it burns his hands. So in the future, if I have gloves that can simulate these effects, I would definitely be interesting to have remote performance or to have simulated physical space. because
Well, now we're all here on stage. We just have
Yeah.
to make that happen, right?
Let's do it.
I think so. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's so great because that's what we see and hear from so many storytellers who recognize the importance of touch, and what they're doing is building these physical props. And while we think that's great and it can make for very immersive storytelling, it doesn't exactly scale, right? Everybody has to go, have to fly around the world to that one particular location. And if you want to have a different story, well, you have to go somewhere else. And hopefully these devices can become more general purpose where headsets and gloves and someday suits and things like that you can have a wide variety of experiences that include things like visuals, audio, touch, different ways of interacting with things without having to go through this, the logistics and real estate and travel of physical prototyping.
And we haven't really talked much about the other senses, smell and taste. Has that come into any of your work? I mean, as I described before, we had this experience about the Amazon rainforest, and we had this company called the Feelies, who were there inside the giant green egg with you, and their role was as a kind of sensorial specialist, and they would sequence smells, heat, wind, sometimes hand you objects, and I found that very powerful, as like an emotionally powerful experience, but also like it totally tricked my mind. And then recently I was in Amsterdam for something called IDFA, the Documentary Film Festival of Amsterdam, and they were combining a lot of technology and food experiences together, and I equally found those engaging. And is that something that you've employed in any of your work? Is this something you would be interested in developing alongside touch?
Absolutely, yeah. So while we're talking a lot about the entertainment aspects of virtual reality and touch, kind of building off what you were talking about, Grace, is building memories. We're using VR for training, that so people can build real muscle memory. We recently had an experience that was a first responder training simulation in which somebody has experienced, there's been some form of an explosion, somebody has a severe injury, they have a collapsed lung, and a first responder is being trained in virtual reality with visuals and audio and our gloves to place a syringe and inflate somebody's lung that's been collapsed, and smell is a component of that as well. And the goal in that instance is to really overstimulate somebody, to bring all of those senses together so that when, God forbid, a real event like that happens, they are more prepared to adequately handle it. And that is useful for something like a training simulator. I think that smell is difficult to generalize and have at your home, but I'd be interested to kind of evaluate the technology and see if something like that appears.
Have you used smell, Grace? I mean, it's a very powerful sense, isn't it?
It is.
Especially for building memories.
Yes, but the research does show that the strongest perceptual channel tends to be visual, and then it's followed by auditory, oral. And then taste of, I guess, haptic, smell, and taste all follow after that. But the more you wrap layers of sensory information, we do find that the longer the memory lasts over time. And so when we test and compare different channels, let's say VR against video, photo, and even print, we do find that a lot of the virtual experiences do last longer over time, and people generally don't forget about the things that they experience through their sensory channels. Now, I would love to integrate the sense of smell in a lot of our simulations. It's just that the technology is a little bit too bulky right now. It's not perfect. I was just reading a new sensory information of smell, where they were trying to electrocute inside of your nostrils.
Whoa.
And I don't know if our participants are willing to do something like that.
Nope. No.
And so if the technology is there, I would love to integrate it. But the sense of smell is also really intricately involved with your personal memories. And so when you remember a certain scent and it's not the same thing, then it might contribute to breaking that sense of presence when you're in the virtual world. So not yet, but I think the technology is coming.
And what about in Alice? I mean, surely you have to drink a little vial of liquid, right?
Yeah,
So.
Taste is incredible as a story tool. In Alice, for example, you need to eat a mushroom. And so what's actually great about feedback and haptic is that, well, for once, you can have things that you see because, as you say, visual cue is more powerful to your brain than any other sensation. So you can trick your brain into thinking that what you're touching, for example, materials, what you touch is not what you feel that you're touching. but the visual is always stronger. You can touch, you can have plastic grass. If it's real grass that you see, you're going to feel it's real grass. But in the same way, you can touch metal, and if you have wood in the headset, you will feel wood. For taste, it's the same. And in Alice, for example, you have this glowy mushroom that you need to eat to get the story moving. And in reality, it's a small sugary meringue. And it's crazy how many people would have different opinion on what they actually ate. No one would say a sugary meringue. And that's pretty incredible because
because the visual sense is
the visual sense is overriding all the other ones, and that's
so they think they're eating an actual mushroom.
So powerful.
They really believe they're eating an actual mushroom.
Yeah,
Wow.
Absolutely. Some of them, and some of them.
Maybe they want to believe it's a mushroom.
They want to believe it's a mushroom. And
I want to believe it's a mushroom,
but it's a sugary meringue.
It has effect in the story.
Yeah, I'm wondering whether the headset even exists in this experience now. I wonder if we've talked a lot about your individual disciplines, but in terms of what you've seen or where we're going with full body immersion, are there experiences that you'd like to talk about or share with the audience, or a particular thing you're really excited about that's of tomorrow? Perhaps we might start with you, Grace.
So I guess I'm more excited about the potentials of scaling virtual reality. So we're currently testing with families, so parents and children, and we're working with the YMCA of Metropolitan Atlanta, and we're trying to see if we can scale at large. And so we are going into 24 after-school programs, and we're trying to see if we can use virtual agents to get parents and children talking more about exercise and how to keep more physically active. And so we find that virtual reality at scale is really difficult. For us, when we test things in the controlled laboratory, participants are following our instructions. They know exactly what to do. If they don't, the researchers are there. But when we install these, and this is a one-year longitudinal study, then it becomes such a massive array of different problems that you would never be able to experience in studios or in controlled laboratories. And so these are definitely problems that we need to solve before we even think about going to scale with virtual reality. Are people comfortable with the technologies? Are parents willing to expose their children to these new worlds? Are they following instructions? If not, then what do you do? If the technology fails, then how do you address them? And so these are definitely really exciting questions that we want to be able to answer in the longer run, where virtual reality at scale needs to happen in order for it to become a ubiquitous sort of a communication tool. And so we're very excited about this.
We do still feel quite far away from that ubiquity, and as Ted was saying earlier, we are. Box on face is still an issue.
It is.
And box on face for children is a real issue. If you look at a photograph of a child with a headset on it, still, even for us who are in the world, still feels a bit weird, right?
Yeah, that too. And if you think about, let's say, one headset and hundreds of children's germy hands on the headset, how do you deal with these issues of even hygiene? Are you going to feel comfortable? A lot of the little children feel claustrophobic in the headsets. To them, because you lose the perception of physical time, if you give them a 2-minute simulation, it feels like a really long time in there. And so what's the appropriate time of the simulation? How do we deal with things like simulation sickness? And so lots of different problems, even administrative problems. How do you deal with Wi-Fi? How do you deal with the people who are a little bit uneasy at having this tech in the schools? Theft is a huge issue as well. And so lots of different things that we haven't even thought about in the control laboratory do weight our solutions out in the field.
No, you can't control human behavior all the time. We're running a little bit low on time, but Matthias, do you have a particular experience you'd like to reflect on or recommend?
It's going to be a bit pragmatic, but I'm very excited about the upcoming age of self-tracking HMDs like the Oculus Quest or similar
so this
device.
Is without the cable to the computer.
Exactly, because part of my work was freeing the viewer from any type of tether and any type of computer and inside space. And now I feel like you're going to see a lot of large-scale, world-scale free roaming experiences. And this opens up a whole Pandora box of new ways to tell stories. And at the same time, I'm very excited about what these guys are doing, which is having tools to avoid doing it the old-fashioned tricks way. I mean, just smell. You were talking about smell, but right now I'm building perfumes and I'm layering down, and inside the experience, I would put some perfumes on some objects. I would put some of them in the fans during the experience and stuff like this. But I would love to scale to be able to deploy my work more easily. I would love to have tools that can actually tackle all this sensory stuff in a more packaged and professional ways.
And Andrew, as the toolmaker, what are you looking
Well, yeah,
to...
it sounds like we're all interested in seeing virtual reality scale. And the way that our company is thinking about it, at least, is that that the way a lot of technologies scale is first it's used in business, in the workplace. If you think of our smartphones, most of us had BlackBerries in the workplace before we had consumer smartphones. Right? And the way that we're seeing businesses adopt virtual reality is using it for training programs, whether it's industrial design uses as well as for car manufacturers, both training and doing design visualizations of feeling the interior of a car before you build it, and then training people on the assembly line. What are the steps you take to build properly, to operate this machinery properly? And we hope that doing things like that, and then doing medical training and other forms, and then location-based entertainment, it'll make virtual reality and gloves and these technologies that can seem they can seem intimidating, but hopefully this normalizes them. That's one avenue towards getting just more exposure to more people in virtual reality, and hopefully at that point, between some combination of that exposure, the technology coming down in price, between it becoming less boxy on your head, gloves getting smaller, we hope, and content catching up, that hopefully all those things converge and it becomes a mass market consumer device that we use every day to experience stories and to have social experiences. And that whole trend, just seeing all of that happen, is what I'm excited about.
Yeah, and I think probably everybody in the room hopes for that too. Thank you very much.